So with 6 long months of silence after Kendrick Lamar dropped arguably the biggest hip-hop diss track of all time, he has finally chosen to let the world know what he really meant when he created Not Like Us. Does he finally reveal the source behind the PDF allegations against Drake? Does he finally expose which Atlanta rapper thinks Drake is a colonizer? Well, stick around because we're going to be breaking down everything Kendrick Lamar said about the Not Like Us record and some other interesting details that he shared about his life, his current mentality, and his approach to this entire beef.
There's a lot of little nuggets in both of their disses that if it wasn't for these breakdowns, and salute to, guys like this, Rapaholics, because I think they directly get it.
So where did Kendrick Lamar do all this talking? Well, he recently sat down with Harper's Bazaar magazine, and he personally requested that the interview be conducted by SZA. SZA, if you guys didn't know, is the first lady of TDE. She's been signed to the same record label as Kendrick Lamar for several years, but ironically, she also used to date Drake all the way back in 2008 or 2009, and as recently as last year in 2023, she appeared on 2 records off his For All the Dogs album. And her and Kendrick obviously have a great relationship, but I just thought it's kind of funny that she's asking Kendrick all these questions about what's arguably the most scathing diss track ever released against one of her ex-boyfriends. But yeah, the editor of the magazine said that Kendrick Lamar wanted SZA to interview him. It's a move that makes sense when, later on, Kendrick explains that he processes information best through connections with others. They also label Kendrick as the closest thing this era of hip-hop has to a truth teller. And that's interesting because I can't help but feel like if Cole didn't make the moves that he made throughout this beef, where he criticized Kendrick's catalog, calling it a snooze fest, 2 days later apologizing, then months later saying that this beef was a bloodbath riddled with social media bots and antics, and he is the more grown, mature person for backing out of this beef at the time that he did. If he didn't do all that, maybe he'd also be roped into hip-hop's closest thing to a truth teller, and it wouldn't just be Kendrick Lamar. So anyway, SZA kicks off the interview by turning to Kendrick Lamar and bluntly asking him, "Are you mentally ill?" Kendrick Lamar's face lights up and he just simply laughs. He answers her question by saying, "I grew up with that term. I was hearing it when I was 5, 6 years old." Basically saying that since a young age, he's been no stranger to seeing the people around him possibly struggling with mental illness. So SZA replies by saying, "So you identify with it, but not as it." And Kendrick says, "My whole thing is, it's all experience. I say some stuff on a record and identify with a moment. And then I don't identify with it anymore. That's just growth for me. All that stuff is subjective. I think it's going back to my inner child, right? I was trying to understand myself, trying to find people I could relate to, how to identify myself outside of myself. It sounds crazy to a lot of people. I really can't see myself out of my body. When I do that, I have no judgment towards it. It's too many eyes on me to not remove myself. That stuff is scary to anybody else." And I mean, to me, this sounds like a pretty stoic way to live your life. Like identifying yourself outside of yourself, or really seeing yourself outside of your body. Basically saying that you're kind of the subject of the different experiences that you go through, and your identity can shift based off the certain circumstances in your life, and you kind of have to have this more like overall grand objective perspective on the different shifts in your personality, and never hold on to just one particular thought or set of beliefs. Always try to evolve. I mean, that's what I kind of got from this. Not gonna lie, it's a little bit of a confusing statement, but there must be a lot of confusing emotions when you're talking about how the biggest artist in hip-hop deals with mental illness. And then SZA proceeds to ask Kendrick if he's scared of the millions of eyeballs are on him at all times. And Kendrick said no, because I've learned that I can't identify with my performances on stage. I can't hold my true identity to that person who is on stage. Because if I did, that means I will judge every movement every time I F up a lyric, every time I'm off key. It's too much to deal with. So I have to have a distance between the performer and the person I close my eyes and look at the ceiling with. I had to develop that tough skin at like 16, 17 years old, not knowing it was not only for my career, but for myself. It's mentally ill for sure. Then the conversation veers more into spirituality and Kendrick's connection to God. He says that spiritual practices contribute to every moment of his day-to-day, and that with no cliche, he literally talks to God. He says, it's to a point where I'll be starting to think that I'm going crazy, but then he has to remind me, no, this is really me. And in terms of personal growth, SZA asks Kendrick what he feels like the top 3 contributing factors to self-transformation in the last few years have been for himself. And he says it's the power of honesty and being honest with himself, perspective about the person sitting across from himself, and learning that vulnerability is not a weakness. And vulnerability is the one that he's still developing the most. SZA then asks him which of these factors has been the hardest for Kendrick to master on that path towards self-transformation, and he replies that it's gaining the ability to be vulnerable. He said, "We talk about our childhood, and I hate going back to that. It's traumatizing. My dad, he was tough. He was militant. As far as every day, you are expected to go to work, take care of your family, and get back up to do it all over again. Being a man type of stuff, right? And he never showed no weakness. He never showed any emotion that could garner a one-up from the person sitting across from him. And I learned to experience that, not knowing I had them same traits, right? But for what I do, there's certainly no growth without vulnerability. If I understood the power of vulnerability earlier, I could have had more depth and more reach to the guys that was around me in the neighborhood coming up. You know, our parents, they never had these outlets to express themselves the way that they wanted to. I've always looked at us as somewhat of a beacon of hope for them." And that's a powerful message, as Kendrick has constantly tried to carry that depth or that positive reach within his music in an effort to help improve the values and morals and quality of life for the youth. And in his most recent releases, ironically, as he becomes more vulnerable, he also realizes that he is not that savior, that his music cannot on its own save the world from the evils that Kendrick Lamar grew up experiencing. But tapping into that vulnerability earlier on, not just within the music, but maybe as a child growing up, could have helped him bring a more positive perspective to the people around him. Obviously, he was the good kid from the Mad City, but maybe he wasn't the most vulnerable kid from that Mad City. SZA then asks Kendrick when the last time was that he cried, and when was the first time that he cried. He said the last time he cried was probably on Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, on the song Mother I Sober. He said that stuff was very deep for him. And SZA asked him, "Would you say you've done more crying recently than you have in your entire life?" And he agreed that yes, he has. As far as the first time Kendrick cried, it was actually documented. It was on stage in 2011 when Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and the entire West Coast passed Kendrick the torch. Kendrick said, "Dre passed me the torch and a burst of energy just came out and I had to let it flow. My tears is all on the internet. And now I look back and I love that moment. I love that that happened because it showed me in real time expressing myself and seeing all the work that I put forth actually came to life in that moment." And funny enough, these are both two moments that Drake highlights in two of his diss tracks against Kendrick Lamar. He says that Kendrick took that whole PDF angle because of the traumas he faced early on, the same exact ones that Drake knew about because he listened to Mother I Sober, even though he completely misinterpreted the lyrics. And on his tailor-made freestyle record, he used Snoop Dogg AI vocals to pretend to be Snoop Dogg, giving Kendrick a pep talk saying, "You know, we passed you that torch at the House of Blues during your performance. Now it's on you to go and destroy Drake," essentially. So it's kind of ironic and funny that Drake used Kendrick's first real moment of documented vulnerability, or the first time that he cried, to tell Kendrick, like, you better drop your diss records already, don't back out of this beef. And he used the most recent time that Kendrick cried to defend himself against the allegations that Kendrick threw once he finally did release those diss records. And SZA then asks what Kendrick Lamar's driving force is. What's fueling him to keep going, and what does he hope to accomplish with his music? Kendrick says, "It's funny. I was asking myself that same thing this morning. I get fulfilled sharing my experiences with the youth and allowing them to hear these stories and hear these experiences and catch up to them. So to actually answer your question, it's communication just with people in general. And I feel my work in music is just the start. I don't think it's my end goal. I know it's not my end goal. Music is just a vessel to get me there." Then SZA asks, "Do you have an idea of what you're supposed to do?" But Kendrick says, "I don't. I'm curious, and that's what keeps me energized." Then the conversation takes an interesting turn as SZA asks Kendrick if he considers himself in touch with his feminine side. Kendrick answers it by saying, "I have to balance both. At first, all I knew was the masculinity, and I always kept that wall up because of my father. But the more I delve deeper into my music and the more expressive I get with myself, that is the feminine energy right there. That's not the bravado that I grew up seeing all the time. This is who I am, the soft-spoken me, and I have to own it. This is where my superpower lies. Because if my job is to communicate, and I need to be able to communicate with everyone, I need to be able to sit in front of SZA and talk to you in a way where you feel comfortable, in a way where it feels authentic from me to you, you to me, and I can't do that with a wall up. I can't do that with my full masculinity." And I think Kendrick kind of links the aspect of vulnerability and femininity hand in hand, and that's something he's kind of working more on to incorporate not only in his music, but in his everyday life, and we're very clearly able to see that with the reflection that he did on Mr. Morale. But a lot of his behavior this year did kind of seem like a complete 180 from that, as he tapped back into that competitive drive, that boogeyman spirit, to really snatch the crown up and win his first real rap battle against someone who was on the same stature as him. And that's where SZA kind of brings up this entire beef, where she says, "Can I ask you a hyper-masculine question? You can also tell me to shut the F up. What does Not Like Us mean to you?" And Kendrick laughs as if like he knew that this question was coming. It's also important to note that this interview was done in August, about 2 months before I'm posting this video, a month before he announced he was performing at the Super Bowl, and likely before Drake released all those 100 gig records. I don't know if that would make a difference in Kendrick's answer, but just interesting to note, this came from his perspective a couple months back. He answers it by saying, "Not like us. Not like us is the energy of who I am, the type of man I represent. Now, if you identify with the man that I represent," and SZA cuts him off by saying, "Break that man down for me." Kendrick answers by saying, "This man has morals, he has values, he believes in something, he stands on something. He's not pandering. He's a man who can recognize his mistakes and not be afraid to share the mistakes, and can dig deep down into fear-based ideologies or experiences to be able to express them without feeling like he's less of a man. If I'm thinking of Not Like Us, I'm thinking of me and whoever identifies with that." Now, very interesting answer, considering the next record he dropped after Not Like Us was Watch the Party Die, or technically doesn't really have a title, but that record, I feel like, encapsulates the description that Kendrick is giving for Not Like Us better than it describes Not Like Us. That was a mouthful, but basically on Watch the Party Die, he's really drawing a line in between the sand of what he believes is toxic towards the culture and the type of man that he represents. I mean, one of the bars in the song was Kendrick saying, "They don't hate me, they hate the man that I represent." And then he goes on to talk about everything he represents in the chorus as he's talking to God, asking him to give Kendrick peace, asking him to bless the way he thinks, and to keep lame people away from him. Whereas Not Like Us also seemed like Kendrick drawing a line in between the sand, but it seemed like he was talking to Drake on that record directly, obviously critiquing people he keeps around him, the motives he has for collaborating with Atlanta artists, and the transactional approach he takes with it, the disrespect that he showed the West Coast and Tupac, obviously the most daunting criticism or allegation with the whole PDF file thing. But I think when Kendrick was answering this question, he wasn't answering it in the sense of what does the entire record encapsulate. I think he meant that the literal statement itself, "Not Like Us," is the energy of who he is, the type of man he represents, and that line in the sand between all the values that he stands for and anyone who identifies with those same values versus basically everyone else. But in the case of the actual record, he's talking specifically to Drake. SZA continues the conversation by saying, "Now, can I say something else in that realm, or do you want me to get away from that? Can I ask you something else?" Kendrick said, "Is it mean?" And that's a pretty funny way to kind of tell SZA to not let the conversation redirect itself into a whole roast against Drake, saying it in a really politically correct way. And SZA answers by saying, "No, it's more so like, I thought it was really interesting that there was this consensus at all that you might be an angry individual. So when you feel the surge of energy in records like that, where is that route? Is it anger?" And Kendrick said, "I don't believe I'm an angry person, but I do believe in love and war, and I believe they both need to exist. And my awareness of that allows me to react to things but not identify with them as who I am. Just allowing them to exist and allowing them to flow through me. That's what I believe." And that's kind of a callback to what he was saying earlier in the interview, where he was talking about not necessarily defining his identity by what he's experiencing or feeling or discussing at that particular period of time. Instead, as he says, he reacts to things, but not necessarily identifies with them as who he is. And SZA caps off this line of questioning about the beef by just saying, "I'm going to quit while I'm ahead before I say something crazy." And that's kind of where it all ends. But it's very interesting to see how Kendrick stays grounded throughout this massive whirlwind of drama and chaos that he's engulfed in within hip-hop. It seems like, just like he was saying on Euphoria, that people might think his life is rap, but it's not. He's got a whole separate life outside of hip-hop, and he's able to easily detach himself from whatever circumstances are going on within his career, because he doesn't necessarily base his identity based off of whatever he's experiencing or however he's perceived within the public eye at that particular period of time. And as far as the Not Like Us record, aside from just drawing a very clear line in the sand between what Kendrick stands for and what the other side stands for, I think it also did a great job at kind of predicting where Drake's career would go next and what has been plaguing it for the last couple of years, especially in that third verse where he obviously discusses Drake being a quote-unquote colonizer of Atlanta culture, running there to collect a few dollars by collaborating with Atlanta trap artists and stealing their sound, their lingo, their production, their culture, and incorporating it into his own aesthetic. And I don't know if Drake is doing it to ironically troll Kendrick, but he's only been doing this more and more as the beef has ended. He just did a Mexican song singing completely in Spanish. He's collaborated with several Atlanta artists since this whole beef ended. He had Lil Yachty and Playboi Carti, two Atlanta artists, on his records, then suddenly removed them. He was doing his best Playboi Carti impression on the record with Playboi Carti. And yeah, essentially has seemed more and more desperate to try and reclaim that title or that success he was having before this beef ever started. And instead of tapping back into a sound that he cultivated, or a sound that's true to the essence of who he is or where he's from or his culture, whether it's Toronto, or just creating something that, again, captures that essence of what he was producing with 40 back in the So Far Gone days or the Nothing Was the Same days. He's instead decided to chase trends, creating gimmicky trap records, delusionally talking about how he hasn't lost this beef or how people tried to destroy him and they couldn't. Anyways, we're not going to make this an entire Drake video. I just thought that Not Likke Us was definitely a very prophetic diss record. And aside from this interview, it does seem like Kendrick Lamar is slowly but surely kind of coming out of his shell a little bit, making a couple more appearances, being a little more outspoken online, and bringing us closer to that inevitable release date of his next album. We know he's going to be at the Super Bowl. We know he did this interview back in August, so I can only assume there's going to be more interviews and magazine covers with Kendrick Lamar's face on it on the way. He's also been directing commercials for Cash App. I believe that him and Dave Free with their media company PG Lang, they're still expected to do a couple more commercials. So we may get new tidbits of new Kendrick Lamar through those commercials. And with the last one, it starred Doechii, the newest member of TDE. And Kendrick Lamar even reposted her mixtape onto his Instagram. This is a very common criticism that people have been giving Kendrick, in that he hasn't really been putting on enough for the West Coast by sharing people's things on Twitter or on Instagram. However, he's never really done this throughout his entire career. He barely has even tweeted or posted anything on Instagram in the last 5 years. But regardless, he posted Doechii saying she's next up. This is great to see because her project was incredible and got a lot of critical acclaim, very high critical acclaim. However, I don't think there was enough mainstream hip-hop listeners checking this project out, because it's really incredible and it can appeal to a much larger, wider audience than I believe it already has. And it'd be great to see that project achieve mainstream success, just because the industry kind of needs a reset right now. Like, we need a project like Doechii's latest mixtape to blow up within the mainstream and shift the overall sound and standard for what people have been putting out recently. We need to go back to cohesive full-length albums. But anyways, that's why I'm happy Kendrick Lamar is sharing her project and her music on his platform. I'm happy he's coming back outside, giving the fans some new interviews, and bringing us one step closer to his next project, while also giving us some details on the thought process behind these legendary diss tracks that he released throughout the summer. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Kendrick accurately described the overall meaning of the Not Likke Us record? Did you want to hear him touch on this a little bit more? Or are you happy with what we got and you want him to move on to the next thing? I know the Drake fans will say he's been milking this record and this beef to the ends of the earth for as much as he could, but he hasn't been, and that's a story for another video. In the meantime, if you want to stay tapped in for the next video, drop a smash on that subscribe button, hit the little like button if you stuck around to the end, and I will catch you guys in the next one.